So to give you a little flavor of what we're going to be doing on Friday night, on Erev Shabbat, here's a piece in Makam Nahawand, or as they say in Morocco, Makam Sahli. And in the West, they call this D minor. And the oud is the ancestor of the guitar, so all the string instruments of the West come out of the oud, because the Moors brought the oud to Spain, and from that the lute developed, and from that the guitar. أمان أمان يا عيني يا مان يا مان يا عيني يا مان يا عيني עיני אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מעם אדוני, עושה שמיים וארץ. אשא עיני אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מעם אדוני, עושה שמיים וארץ. אל ייתן למוט רגליך, אל ינום שומריך, הנה לא ינום ולא יישן, שומר שומר ישראל. אשא עיני אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מעם אדוני, עושה שמיים וארץ. אשא עיני אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מעם אדוני, עושה שמיים וארץ. אל ייתן למוט רגליך, אל ינום שומריך, הנה לא ינום ולא יישן, שומר שומר ישראל. אשא עיני אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מעם אדוני, עושה שמיים וארץ. אשא עיני אל ההרים, מאין יבוא עזרי, עזרי מעם אדוני, עושה שמיים וארץ. עושה שמיים וארץ, עושה שמיים וארץ. Yeah. יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל.
Get on the, there's a train that'll take you right Thank you very much, Rabbi. It's an honor to be invited to address this congregation, what Valley Beth Shalom means to the Jewish community in Los Angeles and so on. Even those of us who are not congregants but are willing to lie about it under certain specific circumstances are aware of it. Well, I guessed wrong about one thing tonight. I knew I should have brought my oud, but I was rushing out of the house and I was thinking, now, what are the chances? But I think I did guess right on what you would be interested in hearing from me speak about this evening. I've got notes, by the way, not so I remember what to say, but so I know what not to say, so I can stick within the hour time limit. If it's not on here, I ain't gonna say it. I thought about this presentation quite a bit because the story of Israel is one of incredible dynamism, transformations, changes occurring at a very heady pace. And so in a way to kind of talk about that dynamism, but taking just sort of a kind of giving you a static snapshot of a bunch of issues, you know, where they are today, really doesn't tell the story. That what you really need to understand is these various paths of transition. What has changed, how things have changed, the rate of change, and one of the things introducing the most tension in Israel today is that not everything is changing at the same rate or in the same direction. So what I want to do is to basically talk in this first part, this hour discussion, about how Israel got to where it is today. For some of you, some parts of this story are going to be familiar, but I'm hoping kind of putting it all together has some value in and of its own. And what I'm going to do is, I can see that the top of the slide is cut off. Is it possible to lower the projector a little bit? The title is cut off. So the things that I really want to talk about are the economics, politics, and institutions. And in a way, I think a lot of what I'm going to say is going to correspond nicely with what Yoav Ben-Horin talked about last week, the sort of cultural transformations that have taken place. I'm going to start and move along a different trajectory, but I think actually wind up in remarkably similar place to what he spoke about. I was not here, unfortunately. I would have loved to have heard his remarks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to really kind of, in the first part of my talk, give you a kind of a political, historical, or actually I should say economic, political timeline. And we'll talk about some of the key turning points. Thank you very much, Alana. Well done. Well done. Yeah, I think no is probably the way we want to go. Okay. I don't have any. No, I don't have any control on the projector. And what I'm going to do is present this timeline, and then I'm going to talk about two kind of special issues. I mean, formally speaking, they're economic issues, but they really have a large implication on a lot of what Israel is dealing with right now. I'm going to talk about, you know, the much vaunted emergence of the high-tech sector in Israel. And then I'm going to talk about the remarkable, almost, biblically miraculous discovery of energy resources in Israel. And both of them really have implications for Israel's politics and society today. And I'm going to end up by talking about, okay, where does Israel go from here? What are the challenges that it faces? Okay? And, if I've used a term that I have not bothered to define, just stand up, run down the aisle, grab me, force me to tell you what it is I'm talking about. Okay. See, now isn't this fun already? I bet you Ben Horan just showed you a lot of film clips and stuff, but now we're going to look at data and numbers and so on and so forth. I've got a lot more respect for you guys. We're going to use this timeline, which tracks the growth in Israel's gross domestic product per capita. Now, gross domestic product merely is a measure of all of the goods and services that were produced in a country during a given year. The goods and services produced by the citizens of the country, the goods and services produced by foreigners and foreign companies that happen to be in that country. And per capita kind of gives you a rough idea of if you took all of this output, if you took all of this wealth creation, all of this income, and you divided it up by the number of people, just, you know, how wealthy people would be. This is a crude measure of economic well-being. It's emphasized far too much, but it's pretty much sort of the standard for understanding where countries are. And we'll begin looking at the early part of Israel's history. We don't go all the way back to 1948, but looking at this pre-1937 period, which I characterize as the ingathering of the exiles. There are some interesting things going on. I mean, it's a little bit like, you know, reading about baseball between the year 1900 or, you know, reading about the Cambrian era and the story of the evolution of life on Earth. It really, it's kind of weird. It seems so very foreign and different, and yet it sets the stage for what is to follow. So this was a period of remarkable economic growth. Why? Well, large population inflows as people, you know, as the population doubled and then doubled again. A lot of capital inflows, principally from American Jewry. A nation of immigrants. And this period comes to an end with the Six-Day War. I say a nation of immigrants. I had the opportunity just this last spring for Yom HaZikaron, for Memorial Day. I was in Israel. I managed to visit the Mount Herzl cemetery. I went with a friend who wanted to pay respects to one of his school buddies who had been a crewman on the Dakar, an Israeli submarine that sank in 1968 with all hands. And it was really remarkable because they have this sort of underground memorial, pictures, and then brief descriptions of each of the crew members, you know, and they come from Romania, and they come from Egypt, and they were, you know, born in Cyprus in 1946, and so you know what's going on. Just an incredible inflow of individuals. It's a country that has been built on European socialist principles, observed through a Zionist lens. So there is a very central role for the government in the economy. It's not central planning like in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe at this time, but it's the closest thing to that. There's a large centralization. The institutions are centralized. Histadrut, the trade union. That was the trade union. If you was a worker, if you made a wage, you were a member of Histadrut. Bank Leumi really was the national bank, period. That's all that there was. And then there were publicly owned companies. To this day, one of the leading examples of that is the Chevrut HaChashmal, the Israel Electric Company. No longer the monopolist quite that it once was, but still a company 100% owned by the government. And then there were other examples, the Bazan oil refineries, the Israel aircraft industry, and so on. Economic policies largely redistributive in nature, really a sort of a complete welfare state. Very much along the lines that the rabbi alluded to in his introductory remarks. Now we come to the next period, 1967 to 1973. You know, we're here to stay. I mean, really for the first time since its foundation in 1948, since the beginning of the conflict with the Palestinians in the 1920s, even going back to the first Aliyah and the economic struggles. For the first time, Israelis really knew that they were here to stay. And it just, an amazing spurt of growth. I mean, in this short period, the economy doubled. Anybody who was in Israel at that time knew that they really considered themselves a special case. They were different. They were special. And for the first time, Israel now is viewed not as a factor in the region, but had actually demonstrated that it was a regional power. This, of course, is the period that is terminated by the Yom Kippur War in 1973, but all kinds of things going on during that time. The Israeli car, what was it called? There was the Sabra, there was the Susita, right? The little horse, and the Carmel. That was the upscale, car. Absolutely economically non-viable, but it was a state industry subsidized by the state. We're going to have our own car and so on. It's really sort of an embodiment of that period. The next period is not so happy. Immediately following the 1973 war, it was a victory for Israel. It was a victory at a tremendous price. I actually had Rosh Hashanah dinner in Haifa in 1973 with a young chemist from Haifa University, whom I learned was, dead within a matter of days in the Sinai, as he was called up as a reservist. This near disaster, combined with the sputtering of the statist model, really now begins to call into question their confidence in the founding leadership, in the labor Zionist leadership of this country. Why did the economic model start to sputter at this point? Well, it's an interesting question. We won't go into it in any great length, but there's an economist named Alexander Gerschenkron who, way back in the 1930s, wrote an essay on economic backwardness in a historical perspective. And what he pointed out is that when you start basically with nothing, it makes a certain amount of sense, you are capable of tremendous, prodigious rates of growth as long as you have all of the inputs. And the growth is of a certain type. It is feeding more and more inputs into the hopper. It is not growth that is necessarily fueled by using those inputs, the people, the money, the natural resources, and so on, more effectively. And at a certain point, you start getting to a law of diminishing returns. Well, this then, of course, is punctuated by the political thunderclap of 1977. I'm sorry, can you see the screen okay? Okay. Where the revisionist Zionist position that had always been there, Jabotinsky against Weizmann, Begin against Ben-Gurion, the labor Zionists of the kibbutzim versus the small manufacturers and business people of Tel Aviv, and very much the Sephardim, the Jews from North Africa and the Middle East versus the Ashkenazi. This was really kind of the world turned upside down, and we've been dealing with the post-1977 world in Israel ever since. And this is, of course, the time when you had the really the kind of the first introduction of free market principles, calling into question and attempting to dismantle this incredible statist apparatus that had been put in place. A couple of other salient points. This is when the first Lebanon War is waged, starting in 1982. For the next 18 years, Israel is going to be in Lebanon. And, for the first time, Israel is fighting a war that is not only against its enemies, but is also being carried on politically, domestically, within its society for 2 decades. And perhaps the most salient thing to note about this period, although one that people sort of forget about, is that this was also a period of incredible economic instability, a period of hyperflation, sort of Weimar Germany or modern Zimbabwe rates of inflation. Yeah, so look at this. There's a period of at least 5 years in which the inflation rate ran at least over 100% a year. Every 12 months, your money is halved in value. Your bank account, your investment, and so on and so forth. I know a family that came to Israel wealthy, made Aliyah right around this time, did the right thing, founded a business, and discovered, in the 90 days between the time they, supplied their customers with the goods and the time when the invoices became due, those 90 days were sufficient to completely destroy their wealth. It's like the old joke about Hollywood. How do you make $1 million in Hollywood? Well, you bring 10 million. It was a little bit the same sort of way. And this was a shattering, devastating thing to experience on top of all that the country had gone through up to that point. And if you look, you see that even though the hyperinflation was dealt with very handily by about 1985, the inflation was not really squeezed out of the system until 20 years later, about 2005. And that's an important part of the story that I will get to right now. Because the reason that this was squeezed out of the system was because of the stabilization program that was introduced, drastic program to completely revamp the economy. This is when the new Israel shekel was introduced, the modern currency, to replace the old shekel, which replaced the lira, for those of you who remember. Government spending was choked off. And the most important thing here is the rise of the office of the budget. Now, people outside of Israel don't know about the Misrad Taktzivim, the office of the budget. This is the most powerful entity in the state of Israel. The second most powerful person in the government who is not a politician is the director of the office of the budget. The most powerful one, of course, is the director of the Bank of Israel. And the reason I say that is that part of the reform was that everything had to be approved by the office of the budget. It was tended to be largely independent. It doesn't report to the Director General, the senior civil servant of the Ministry of Finance. It reports to the Minister of Finance. It's like a parallel system. And I visited, the first director of the budget whom I knew invited me to come by his office. It was a summer evening. It was about 9 at night. He was, doing his usual stint, working until 11 o'clock. And he pointed to his desk and the piles of paper, and he said, look, everything, literally everything winds up on my desk. It has to be approved. I don't know what basis I should approve something. I don't know whether it's a good idea or not, but the point is this, that you think government is run by the Knesset and the cabinet, which is to say the government ministers. But the ministry, under the minister, comes up with some idea for a program, or the Knesset approves some program, and it goes to the office of the budget, and the director of the budget is a 30-year-old guy, a 35 maybe year-old guy, and his 5 assistant directors who are master's degree students of economics in their late 20s or early 30s. They say, no, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. Now, if it's the Minister of Defense, that's another story, and that's part of the tale. But this is a very important part of Israel today, and the important thing about a hyperinflation like that is whether you're working in a central bank or some office of the budget, once you have spent your early professional life fighting inflation, over 10 years, over 20 years, that's how you view your job for the rest of your life. This is how this office views its job. And the question is, well, what happens when it's not so much, inflation that it's an issue, but certain vital elements of Israel's infrastructure that need investment or change or so on, you start to have a conflict in cultures and ideas about what government goals and missions should be. This is also the period, the continuing period of good growth. Can it locate the internet? I didn't ask you to. I really didn't mean to do that. And also, a couple of really big immigrations, the Ethiopian immigration and then the huge Russian immigration. This is a good thing. An economy is an engine. An engine needs fuel. People are the fuel of an economy. Yeah, there are resources and so on, but the reason people are important is they are the ones who actually make things, and even more importantly, they are the people who buy things. The scale of the immigration from the former Soviet Union in the United States today would be similar to having 40 or 50 million new entrants into the United States over a period of 10 years. Basically 1.5 brand new Californias into the United States. Imagine that scale. People are good, they're very useful to an economy, but absorption takes time, and there needs to be a period of integration and so on. Also something else that's okay. This kind of gives you an idea of how demographics have been such a large part of the story of Israel and Israel's growth. Here you see in red the OECD, basically the club of developed economies, sort of what their average population increase is annually. Countries like the United States, countries like Korea, which started out with really high population growth and are getting pretty close to zero population growth. Countries like Japan or Germany or Italy, where they've basically gotten out of the business of making babies, zero or less than zero population growth. But Israel is consistently growing. And the growth of your economy basically comes from two things. It comes from the growth in your population and the growth in your productivity. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. This is a little something I put together in a different context. This is also a period where there is a transition in the relationships between the large Sephardi ethnic community in Israel and the large Ashkenazi community. So this is actually kind of interesting. It looks silly at first. This is basically the share of Mizrahi, Sephardi songs on an annual basis, looking by decade in the top 10 list, the annual top 10 list of one of the popular radio channels in Israel. And so you see it in the 1970s from basically 0%. Now, the Sephardi population in the 1970s, I didn't look this up, but it had to have been at least 40, if not 50% of the state of Israel. And there was no airplay on the radio of their music, to the point where currently about 45%, it now sort of represents something close to being representative of the sample of the population. Now, what does this mean? Does it mean that the Sephardi-Ashkenazi divide has gone away? Does it mean that everybody is really, oh yeah, great, this is so wonderful, let's hear some Mizrahi music? No, not by any means. I mean, there are people who will look at this and say, you see, these people want to take our country away from us. So there's something subtle going on here. I mean, you now have marriages, intermarriage is actually fairly common between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. When, at the founding of the state, it was very, very rare. There are, Sephardi professors, there are Sephardi army officers, and so on and so forth. But there is still, if not, the divide or the opposition that there once was, this sort of identification, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, is kind of, to use the language of medicine or epidemiology, it's kind of comorbid with a number of other things. Yeah, I don't dislike you because you're Sephardi, but I don't like your music. I don't like the way you practice your religion. I don't like the political parties you vote for. We did different service in the military and so on. It's worthwhile sort of putting here at this point the whole question of pluralism in Israel. Is Israel a pluralistic country? And perhaps, we're not going to get into this in any detail, but perhaps one of the ways to best enter this issue is to ask the question, okay, there used not to be any, segregated units in the IDF, in Tzahal, in the military. Now there are specific units for ultra-Orthodox men, for the yeshiva bochers who no longer have a government subsidy and instead are in the army. Is this emergence of these special units an example of pluralism or precisely the opposite? And I think the answer is maybe, which is to say there are really kind of two concepts of pluralism that are at play in Israel. I mean, there is the one that we as Americans are kind of familiar with, which is, well, wait a minute, segregated army units? No, this is where, people should be serving together. Everybody should have equal opportunity. It shouldn't be closed off. There shouldn't be. And so this is looking at pluralism on the level of the individual. But remember, Israel is a Middle Eastern country, and it has traditions that have extended through the British Mandate, which in turn were extended from the time of the Ottoman Empire. And in the Ottoman Empire, there was sort of a different view of pluralism. The pluralism was not so much at the level of the individual. Pluralism was by community. Yes, you're Armenian. Yes, you're Greek. Yes, you're Alawite, and so on and so forth. But you are free within your community to, carry on your practices and so on. And that's a little bit what's happening in Israel. And this is actually a point of conflict, particularly when you bring American Jews into the equation, because this is very difficult to understand, and this is really part of a lot of the discussion about religious freedom and freedom to worship in the Kotel and so on. But that is not on my list of things to talk about, so I'm not going to say anymore. Okay. All right. So you have sort of the neoliberalism of the Likud fighting the implicit logic of a system that had originally been put together with a whole series of core institutions. Throughout this period, you have Benjamin Netanyahu using the example of the fat man being carried around on the shoulders of the skinny man. The fat man, of course, is the bloated state, the inherited apparatus from the first years of Israel. The skinny man is the entrepreneur, the businessman, the private sector, and so on and so forth. So this is a metaphor saying that the government is way too large. At the end, I'm going to suggest a different way of looking at this. It's also the time of the Second Intifada, which ultimately is a challenge met successfully by Israel, largely by 2004, formally and officially by 2005, 2006. And this is a very important event. It's a very important event economically, not for Israel, but for Palestine, the Palestinians, and the relationship between the Palestinians. What this does is it marks the end of what had been economic integration between the two communities. In 1996, the last year when I could find some figures, a few years before the Second Intifada, 40% of the Palestinian labor force worked on the Israel side of the Green Line. And so when all of a sudden they didn't work there, what did the Israelis do? They really didn't suffer much losses. They started to bring in workers from Romania, from the Philippines, from Thailand, and so on and so forth. The GDP per capita figures for the Palestinians plummet. going from something like, the equivalent of $1,500 to, less than $900. It also marks the final separation of peoples. Up until this point, Israelis and Palestinians sort of knew each other. But you think about it, the people who are in their early 20s in Israel have really no experience of being in contact with Palestinians. Yes, Israeli Palestinians, but not people, on the other side of the Green Line. The first time they come in contact with them is when they do their military service, and they're sent to, Hebron or Jenin. And it also marks, because this really kind of knocked the Peace Now movement out of the ring, really sort of marked the ascendancy of the revisionist Zionist perspective. It didn't necessarily change the voter base. If, the polling is really consistent on the question of, would you be willing to give up the West Bank in exchange for peace? It's still running in the, in the 60%, 2/3 of the people. But even so, the revisionist Zionist perspective becomes far more vocal, and this is also the period when, the settlement in Judea and Shomron, in the West Bank, goes from the tens of thousands to the hundreds of thousands. And then, of course, there is the economic crisis of 2008. Which you can see had not that much effect on Israel. If you look at how the Israeli economy did compared to, the average OECD country, where, the plunge in 2009 was, something approaching 4% on average. I mean, this is, stunning economic crisis. Israel, yeah, they're taking a hit, but they're still growing. Remarkable resilience. So this is the period in which Israel really sees its final transformation. It's no longer this nation of chalutzim, back in the founding, a country of agriculturalists and small manufacturers. It now becomes an important hub in the global knowledge economy, with everything that implies. And we'll talk now, or in a little bit, about what sort of tension that introduces into the system. One of the symptoms of transition was in 2011, when there were the so-called social justice protests. And these were protests by the middle class. These were not Israel's poor out in the street. These were middle-class people saying, we can't live under these circumstances. We demand, greater social justice. Well, what does that mean? It meant, among other things, that Israel's economy, again, I'm talking now about institutions and systems that were set up at one point and that continue into a period in which they begin to actually have a harmful effect. If you look at the grocery basket of the average Israeli, you've got 75% by value of what goes in the grocery basket having very little import into the country. That means very little competition. That means, monopolization, or at the very least, cartelization. You have a relatively small number of firms and individuals who are basically able to set prices at will without much competition. The other 25% are things that actually do have a fair amount of import competition. I think I have, so this is another slide. This is basically looking at, sort of average cost of living, again, against a whole bunch of countries that Israel is routinely compared to. And you see that Israel's cost of living is second only to that of Japan. But housing has become a very very big issue. And again, this is a middle class issue. Here is the increase in housing prices. Here's the Second Intifada. The housing prices are kind of, going like this. Now the Second Intifada has been defeated, and you see housing prices moving from somewhere 90, when we set the year 2000 as 100, going up to something like 160, 170. In other words, pretty close to a doubling in housing prices. And where this really hits is is in young family formation. And one of the reasons that this exists is because of another factor that exists in Israel, which has a remarkably high level of average life expectancy, both male and female. It's one of the highest in the Western world. Well, what used to happen, of course, is when, Baruch Hashem, but, after a long life, grandpa or grandma died, then the grandchildren would get a legacy, and they would use that to start a house, to start a home. Buy a place to live, and so on and so forth. Now, grandpa and grandma are living into their 80s and their 90s and so on, and the housing prices have gone up. So the phenomenon of adult children and married adult children living with their parents is, it's kind of driving everybody nuts. And then, there was a very large element in these protests on the issue of burden sharing. And this is when, for example, the issue of exemptions for yeshiva students from service in the military comes to the fore. I'm not going to go into detail on this because I don't want to run out of time. Let me move forward. Yeah, I got it. Okay. So the social protests were in 2011. One of the most interesting things about them is how they sort of petered out. I know lots of people who were, involved in, how do we turn this into a movement and so on. And that's a whole nother tale, how that happened. But this leaves us with the question of, okay, where does Israel go from here? And I'm going to get into that. First, I'm going to talk, I think briefly, perhaps more briefly than I had intended, about high technology and about natural gas, which I think you will see leads into kind of the final remarks I wanted to leave you with. This is a period of transformation. There have been many transformations up until now, but there's one interesting one that I want to leave you with, and that is the transformation of institutions, in the sense that really for 40 years now, Israel has been by and large governed from the right. If you look at the elites in the society, however, during this period, and by that I mean lawyers and academics, presenters on the news and so on and so forth, professors in the universities, they have come from the left. And what I think I'm now beginning to see is, at long last, this transition where the nature of the elites are changing. Just, my colleagues at RAND are very excited when they, get some kind of a, cooperation agreement with institutions like the Israel Democracy Institute and the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv and so on, the ones that are very, very well known and very well respected in the West. But the interesting thing is, people in the government, people who are part of this government, the various parties, they don't listen to these people. That's not whom they're talking with. And that is also something that is changing. There is, if you take the long view, and if you look at Israel's growth from 1950 until just before the Yom Kippur War, you see this trajectory. And if you look at if you project it into the future, it would have gone like this. This is the actual growth path. So then the question becomes, well, wait a minute. I mean, there's all this growth and all this population and so on. What's the story here? And the story is partly stems from this. Remember when I talked about productivity? That you can grow the size of your economy basically by pouring more coal into the hopper, stuffing in more inputs, or you can grow it by using those inputs more efficiently, more effectively. And that's what productivity is. It's basically how much stuff that people are willing to buy can you crank out with a certain amount of, labor and capital and so on. So it's important. You want to know what the growth of an economy is going to be? Well, it's difficult to predict, but you can tell what the maximum is going to be. It's going to be the population growth rate plus the rate of growth of productivity. That's what makes us wealthy. It's when, we can actually get more stuff than we put in, then everybody, in theory at any rate, gets a cut of that. So this is looking at productivity change, over 4 decades in the so-called G7 countries. And this is the productivity growth in Israel. And you see that it's diverging as time goes on. You can get another view. The OECD 12, this is the OECD average. These are countries to which, you can really are kind of comparative to Israel. Slovakia, Spain, Sweden, Czech Republic, Denmark. These are not the Chinas or the United States or anything like that. This is productivity growth in those countries, and here's productivity growth in Israel. Well, there's a lot that goes into this, and obviously I'm not going to get into it. But there are issues of education, who is learning what. There are issues related to the next topic I'm going to talk about, which is high technology, and very much, who gets to participate in this and what benefits they receive. Because what you discover is I tried to find this, I've seen it, but I couldn't find it in time for this talk. If you take Israel's productivity, you discover a bifurcation within Israel itself. You have the relatively high value adding industrial sectors, very high export sectors that actually have a high productivity. And then basically you have the rest of the country, rest of the industry, the cement manufacturers, the textiles, you name it, which is sort of flatlined. So let's talk a little bit about high technology, the startup nation. All around the world, people are trying to capture lightning in a bottle. They're trying to come up with the next Silicon Valley. And it's interesting, I've had this conversation in Washington and in Ottawa and Brussels and Jerusalem and Seoul and Beijing. And it's really remarkable how everybody is in fear of losing the race for the future. And this is really, what they're interested, because this really is part of the productivity puzzle. Somehow, Israel seems to have captured lightning in the bottle. They have managed to produce a very important, very creative, and very lucrative high technology sector. How did this come about? Well, it's interesting. Sharon Nazarian, the president of the Nazarian Family Foundation, is actually a scholar, and she used to teach a course at UCLA doing kind of a comparison between the growth of South Korea and the development of Israel. So she had me come in and speak to her class. And only at that point did I really pick up something that I knew, but I really hadn't picked up the significance. If you look at South Korea, it started with nothing after the Korean War, a literacy rate of, 85% and so on. And look where it is today. And it followed, a course of development in which, 25 years after the Korean War, you started seeing, major universities and then graduate programs and then laboratories and so on, which they're still building today. If you look at Israel, you see exactly the opposite. 25 years before the founding of the state, they had a major academic institution, Hebrew University. They had a major science institution, the Weizmann Institute. They had a major institute of technology, Technion. Really quite remarkable. Another factor is, students of innovation, the history of innovation, they point out that, yeah, you need a lot of, factors, you need trained people and so on and so forth, but you also need sort of an environment of creative insecurity. There's some sort of a threat, external or internal, that you need to really spur this creativity. And boy, did Israel have that in spades. So, there's a very large military demand, which goes actually beyond direct orders and really affects the whole society. There was the Arab boycott. It was to Israel's advantage to develop exportable and tradable goods, that for which the entire year's output could fit into the cargo bay of 1747. Or to produce components or software that were buried into the, major products of Intel and manufacturers like that. You have the Russian Aliyah that I spoke about. The Jews were very highly represented in the technical intelligentsia in Russia and the other countries of the Soviet Union. There were a lot of government policies, most of which had absolutely no effect whatsoever. One that did is the establishment of a series of basically venture capital funds. Again, time doesn't allow me to go into this in any great detail, but these were basically sort of challenge grants, matching grants put up by the government. They sought other funding, largely from Wall Street, from the United States, and then they were able to fund a lot of startups. But the most important thing, when you look at innovation, when you look at the hot spots around the world where things are really happening, what you see are incredibly dense networks, connections, lots of people talking to lots of people about things that ordinarily you wouldn't think they'd be talking about, that cut across, the intersections of fields of science and industrial sectors and so on. Well, in Israel you had the IDF, young kids, really hot technologists would go into, Shmoneh Matayim, Unit 8200, which is Israel's equivalent of the National Security Agency. They would go into the Talpiot program and so on. They would work on military projects. They would develop these teams, and then when their service was over, these teams would then basically take these developments outside, with some restrictions, obviously, but largely with the blessing of the IDF. So you had these teams, these very innovative teams, already built, and they were like, seeds or seedlings, planted in the Israeli economy. I will do this very quickly. It's probably interesting to nobody but me. And it's also a little bit of an eye chart. The idea is this. This represents the United States in each one of these things I'm going to show you. And this is sort of a measure of innovative propensity per capita. I won't go into what the exact measure is. And here you see kind of the leading countries. Japan, not at all far behind the United States, in some ways ahead. If you're looking at innovative propensity per capita, Sweden, Canada, Switzerland, and Germany. Then you have a whole bunch of countries that you would kind of bet money on. The Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, the UK, France, Ireland, Belgium. With the exception of the Netherlands, not really very much going on in a relative scale. In each one of these cases, we set the value of the US at 1 for each year. Now look at Israel. Starting basically from nothing in about 1970. I'm sorry? You can't? Oh, I'm so sorry. What you see, if I was to put Israel on this graph, you see Israel going from here to about here, basically leaving all of these other countries in the dust. And part of it is because there's been a really, Israel's bet big time on its high technology. All right, I'm running out of time, so let me do this very quickly. Okay, so this is a good thing. what are the consequences? What are the concerns? Well, one of them is that, is this sustainable? That is to say, the things that made this possible, are they going to continue into the future? There's not going to be another large Russian immigration. Probably not. And also, you know, no national champions have emerged. That is to say, Israel has not developed sort of the equivalent of a Nokia, for example, in Finland. And you start to ask the question, well, why is that? And it has a lot to do with kind of the system that they operate in, the business environment, and so on. I will touch on that a little bit. One of the big concerns is education. This, I don't know, can people see this in the back? Okay. So these are our PISA exams, 25 OECD countries. Here you see where Israel stacks up versus the others. The only country that is lower is the Slovak Republic. Well, you say, okay, this, you know, what about the, there's the Arab sector, which has low educational accomplishments, and sure enough, it's very, very low. But you take that out, and you take out the Haredim, and you still find kind of this sort of middling performance. This is a concern that people have, and again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into it, but a number of other changes come about as a consequence of this. For example, it used to be the case that the children of the Ashkenazi elites, would go into the really prestigious combat units of the IDF. And that happens much less now. Now they want to go into the high technology branches, they want to go into the intelligence branches. Again, you have to understand that, for Israelis, military service goes beyond military service. It really kind of establishes your connections, for the future. It's whom you're going to do business with. It's whom your colleagues are going to be later in life. So that changes. Another thing that changes is there's kind of a cocooning effect. This access to the technical elites really is something that is available only to a relatively narrow section of the society and the socioeconomic sphere. They're very localized within the country, basically the northern parts of the Gush Dan, the outskirts of Tel Aviv, places like Herzliya and so on and so forth, in Haifa. And also, a little more subtly, a lot of the technology they're developing is really sort of projected outside. It's, they're doing things on the web. They're creating software that's going to go into, componentry or applications that are built elsewhere. They're based in Israel, but they're really kind of looking out, and there isn't a lot of cross-pollination between this high-tech sector and sort of traditional sectors of industry, or agriculture and so on. Okay, this is the number of days needed to start a business in a number of OECD countries. This gets back to Netanyahu's the fat man sitting on the shoulders of the skinny man. Okay. Very quickly about the natural gas. Yeah, I got it. Israel's an energy island, kind of like Japan or South Korea. That is to say, it has no physical connections, or had until recently no physical connections with any of the countries surrounding it. If the grid goes down, the grid goes down. It's not like you're going to shunt in supplies from Egypt or Jordan or so on. It faces a number of problems with energy, one of which is that, remember, this is a country that has sort of the energy intensity and economy of a developed country, but the population growth of a developing country. And so what you see is this is the growth of the economy, and this is the growth of energy consumption. Energy consumption is growing greater than the economy is growing. Now, this is kind of interesting, because if you look at the state of California, what you would see is, kind of a similar growth in GDP, and you would see the increase in energy consumption kind of going like this. It's been sort of flatline. California is becoming increasingly efficient in the use of electricity and therefore can grow the economy without growing more electricity. But Israel needed electricity. They had relied up until 1973 on oil to produce electricity. After the oil embargo, they shifted to coal. There are problems with coal, so they began to start looking at the possibility of natural gas. Originally, there was a deal brokered between Israel and Egypt by the World Bank because Egypt had a lot of natural gas and Israel was going to buy the natural gas. And then lo and behold, Israel discovered that it had its own natural gas. To be sure, it was offshore, but initially it was pretty close in offshore. Something on the order of 33 billion cubic meters. Their consumption, when they started consuming natural gas, it was about 3 billion cubic meters a year. So kind of enough to keep them going for a dozen years. And then they discovered a reserve that is about 3 times that size, about 90 billion cubic meters, and then discovered a reserve that was about 250 billion cubic meters, and then discovered the reserve, so-called Leviathan, well named, that was something like 650 billion cubic meters, maybe as much as 1 trillion, but 650 billion in proven reserves. So all of a sudden, Israel not only has enough gas for its own needs, but has potentially commercial quantities of natural gas. Okay, so what's not to like about this? Well, a couple of things. There's such a thing called the resource curse. It sounds very superstitious, but basically it's just noting that there's a correlation of social instability, corruption, poverty, and so on, precisely in states that actually find that they have large natural resources. The other issue that they face is that, as you can see, these finds get farther and farther out into relatively deep water. And so you need a lot of finance and a lot of technical expertise, more than Israel has, in order to exploit this natural gas. And so this now begins to raise the question of, well, whose gas is it? Who does it belong to? To what extent is this Israel's? To what extent does it belong to the people of Israel? To what extent does it belong to the foreign companies that are brought in? To what extent does it belong to the Israeli firms that are partners with the foreign companies? And what will it be used for? Again, I don't have time to go into this. Maybe we can do this in questions. But this turned into a major domestic political dispute over exactly how this gas was going to be used. It showed that there was an inability of the government to efficiently kind of deal with this question. It also exposed a whole series of fault lines. And so what you find is in the natural gas issue, as in the high technology issue, as in housing and so on and so forth, that the argument is more about housing. There are fundamental ideas, differing views on things like class and wealth and intergenerational equity. Do we, exploit the gas now? Do we leave it in the, in the ground or under the sea for future generations? National priorities. Where does environmental concern come in? The increasing concentration of capital and wealth into very, very few hands in Israel. There are basically 19 families that own the country. That's really what it boils down to. Very extreme concentration of wealth. Matter of fact, there was a study that just came out from the OECD just in the last couple of days, looking at the great income disparities, huge income disparities in Israel. And the question is, well, are there too many poor people or too many rich people? You know, where's this coming from? Turns out in Israel, the answer is there are a very, very small number of people who have tremendous amount of wealth. And so this debate over the natural gas really becomes something like a kind of like a Rorschach test. You know, how are you going to look at this issue? Is this, you know, a national asset to be held for the benefit of all, and not, you know, the source of even greater wealth for relatively small people, a small group of people? Is this going to be a hedge for the future for all of Israel? And on the other side, you have a group saying, well, look, this is an important resource. It requires considerable external assistance that will ultimately, you know, benefit, you know, the government balance sheet. Oh, and by the way, you know, there are a whole bunch of other places where their gas is coming online, and unless we move very quickly and exploit this quickly, we're going to miss the boat. So what you really see here in this and in so many issues is kind of a rapid bifurcation that seems to be happening increasingly in Israel. And this really kind of brings me to the end of what I wanted to say, really kind of two big issues, and that I will highlight that, you know, I think are more important to determining the future of Israel than, you know, the number of missiles that Hamas has in Lebanon, or you know, what the Iranians are going to do. I look internally, and that's where I begin to fear. And by the way, I had this conversation with some of the, you know, senior staff in Israel's Ministry of Strategy, and they did not disagree with this view. So the first of these is that increasingly what you see are two Israels. You know, in the high technology sphere, we have already talked about the fact that, you know, these people are involved with the greater world. They're, in a certain sense, kind of isolated or protected from insulated from the country. There are vast differences between the productive and non-productive sectors, and this begins to show. I mean, Israel is really, in many respects, coming to resemble kind of the nation state of Tel Aviv, and then the rest of the country. You know, if you look in terms of class, if you look in terms of money, if you look in terms of professions, and so on. This raises really, you know, serious issues, particularly what is the meaning of this great inequality in a Zionist, or should we say post-Zionist nation, where more than most countries, the ethic had been, we're all in this together, we all succeed or we all fail together. This is not an egghead question. This is a question that's being asked, you know, in coffee houses, and you know, is being raised in newspapers and so on and so forth. You have this whole issue of poverty in Israel. This is part of the two Israel problem. This is a comparison of the share of households below the poverty line in 23 OECD countries. And the red line on the top is Israel. You know, 20% of households are, I'm sorry? Okay, 20% of households are below the poverty line, second only to Mexico in the OECD. Disposable income, basically the same story. This is now the Gini coefficient, and this is a measure of income disparities. And here you see, you know, Israel, you know, at something like, you know, 37. I mean, 0 would be a country in which everybody has exactly the same amount. 1 would be a country in which one person owns everything and nobody owns anything else. And Israel's, you know, at 37, higher than the United States in recent years. I won't show that. You know, and on top of this, you have the middle class angst. You have this, you know, a perception of corruption, unequal burden sharing, and so on. The second issue is one that I think is much more subtle, and that is, how is Israel to be governed in the coming years? How are these decisions going to be made? How are these various tensions going to be resolved through policy, through, you know, the interaction of stakeholders and government and so on to come to a resolution? And one of the things you notice in Israel is the kind of stasis in the political sphere. You know, it seems like a very, you know, vibrant political system in which, you know, parties come and parties go, and presidents go to jail, and prime ministers, you know, get you know, et cetera, and the personalities change. But from a different perspective, you see something that's sort of frozen in space. These are the results of the 2015 election, the most recent election, the number of mandates equivalent to Knesset seats that the various parties had. And it's a different profile from, you know, the previous election. Different parties, you know, the Kadima party has completely disappeared, for example. And yet, if you look at it a slightly different perspective and begin to not look at the party labels, but basically whom they represent, something else appears. So if you call these parties, you know, Likud, Habayit HaYehudi, Yisrael Beitenu, the Nationalist Right, 44 seats. The Social Democratic Left, Meretz, and the Zionist Union, the current incarnation of the Labor Party, 29 seats. What I call the boutique center parties. Every so often a savior kind of emerges in Israel and everybody gets all excited about him or her, and they form a party and they last for, you know, 1 or 2 elections. This is Kulanu and Yesh Atid, 21 seats. So, you know, this is kind of the situation at the end of the 2015 election. Look at the results of the 2013 election if you take the same perspective. 43 seats as opposed to 44. 29 seats as opposed to 29. 21 seats as opposed to 21. The big change you see is in the religious parties, largely because they changed the number of mandates you needed to get in. So this is kind of bad enough. It's not that the situation is stable or is it equilibrium. It's kind of frozen into kind of a stasis. The bigger problem I see, and this is really something I was not aware of until I really started working in Israel, working with the government on issues and so on, is the really fundamental problems of governance in Israel. Now, to be sure, this is not just an Israeli problem. For a number of years, I have been talking about a quiet but nonetheless systemic crisis of democratic institutions of government around the world. Israel, India, Europe, Japan, UK, United States, and so on. You see the same manifestations, problems of trust, perceptions that the government is incapable of meeting challenges, kind of a growth industry in making sure that whatever shortcomings government has are amplified in the perception of the public and so on. But there are a number of things that in Israel are particularly worrying. You see this extreme stovepiping of governmental functions. So what do I mean by that? I mean that a lot of the problems that, you know, modern economies face are not necessarily easily parceled out to the Ministry of National Infrastructures, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Labor. They actually all have some piece of the puzzle. And the interagency process in Israel is non-existent. There's an extreme short-term focus. If they want a piece of analysis done, they want it in 4 months. It's inconceivable to them that anything would take longer than that, even though these are issues that have been building up over the decades. There's an uneven sharing of responsibilities between levels of government, between sort of the national level and the local level. At the same time, there's a diffusion of responsibility and limited accountability. They become very activated by crisis. The standard Israeli approach You know, when something like the 2011 protests occurred, these were long anticipated surprises. You could just sort of look at the graphs that I've been showing you for the last hour and say, well, something's got to give. And yet, it was a surprise to the government. Not necessarily to individuals in the government, but as an organization, there was no way to anticipate this. And so what do? Time after time, they appoint a short-term commission, and they tell them, we want you to report in 8 weeks and tell us what to do. And this is, you know, particularly problematic in issues that cross ministerial portfolios or that require thinking both in the short term and the long term. Now, I could go on and talk about some of the reasons why this exists in Israel. You know, the cultural reasons, the sort of the can-do ethic that comes out of the kibbutz or out of the army. The fact that there's an existential threat. That is to say, Israel faces the same number of problems that any, you know, developed, advanced, heterogeneous economy and society faces, plus a few more that nobody else faces that kind of trump the issue and suck all the oxygen out of the room. Go back to Netanyahu's image of the big fat man sitting on the shoulders of the small man. I would say that the government of Israel is actually too small. What do I mean by that? It has just as many moving parts as, you know, a country like France or the United States, but those parts are much smaller. So when you get to the part of the government that needs to sort of be the thinking part, looking ahead and so on, you have remarkably few people, you know, doing all of the work. I spoke about the office of the budget, how powerful it is in Israel. I asked, okay, so how many people do you have doing research, you know, in this office? The answer was the research staff of the entire Ministry of Finance is 6 people. You know, don't imagine a big building sitting out someplace, you know, stuffed with people. The office of the budget is on the 3rd floor of the building that houses the Prime Minister's office, and, you know, it's not a really big building. And you have the basic logic of the system. This now harks back to the very first part of my talk. You still sort of, you combine this relatively small size with the fact that the government is still kind of central in a lot of the decisions that need to be made. This is one of the things that concerns me the most, and this is why I had the opportunity to actually do something about it. I did a project for the Prime Minister's office precisely on this issue of strategy. Formally, the project was on long-term socioeconomic strategy, but what I really wanted to point out to them is that what they needed to do was to build kind of an integral function. There was some office that was actually thinking strategically, that was looking out to the long term, that was considering, you know, all of the various angles of these very complex problems. And I'm proud to say that these recommendations were accepted by the government in October of 2012. There has been this office since 2013, and we will wait and see whether, in fact, they and their colleagues are able to weather the challenges of the years to come. Well, I've tried your patience quite a bit. I recognize that. I apologize, you know, I think we should take a break. You guys definitely deserve one, and then we can talk a little bit more.
So, unlike the government of Israel, we can make decisions. So here's how this is going to work. This is dictatorial. It's 8:33. We're going to take a quick break, because I want to use our time with Dr. Popper. So quickly, run over there, use the bathroom, get a coffee, put a brownie in your face, and come back right here, and we have some important questions to ask Dr. Popper about the things he's taught us. Thanks so much. Make this quick. There's a quiz next week. and I'm going to give you a chart and let you fill it out. So I want to make sure you got the quiz. So I think you saw some very important information here, right? You saw the growth of GDP per capita, right? Which means you have an economy which is growing at a remarkably fast rate. You saw that, right? Right? We saw, however, we saw that the growth of technological acumen. But you also saw a sort of lower rate of growth in productivity, lower than the G7 or lower than the OECD, the other developing countries, right? And the most interesting, at the end, what he showed us was that thing called the Gini coefficient, which is a number that was created to try to describe the gap between the rich and the poor, right? If the number was 0, there'd be no gap between the rich and the poor. Everybody would pretty much have the same, okay? In a society where the gap between the rich and the poor is relatively low, you have a number which is relatively low, right? In Israel, the gap between the rich and the poor is substantial. In fact, it's much greater than you find in all the other developing countries in the world except Mexico. Except Mexico, okay? You all saw that, right? So and then what happened was, what Professor Popper talked about was that when were those, the cottage cheese riots? 2012, 2000? Right, so there were these big, remember when the Occupy movement came to America, the movement in Israel was called the cottage cheese riots. What had happened was that the price of cottage cheese was going up. Israelis eat a lot of dairy. Well, that's what happened. You see, the price of cottage cheese was going up, and everybody eats cottage cheese. And a couple of Israelis went to Europe, and they had vacationed in Europe, and they went to the local supermarket, and they bought cottage cheese, and they realized that all over Europe, cottage cheese is cheaper than in Israel. And the problem is that the Israelis are making their own cottage cheese. The question is, why is cottage cheese so expensive? Well, it's not just that cottage cheese was expensive. Everything was more expensive. The most powerful thing was rent in Tel Aviv. It was expensive. And if your name is Daphne Leaf, and you're a young woman, and you finish the army, and you go to college, and you get yourself a nice job as a graphic artist in an advertising agency in Israel, and you're making a very nice living, and you can't afford an apartment. So you have this huge social protest. Thousands and thousands of people came out and camped on Rothschild Boulevard, which is the equivalent of thousands and thousands of people coming out, demonstrating and camping on Wilshire Boulevard. I mean, that's what it looked like in Tel Aviv, and not just Westwaring. But not just hippies with long hair smoking dope. Members of Knesset came out, television personalities came out, singers and dancers, I mean, all kinds of actors came out. The whole country came out and supported this thing. And then it disappeared. It went away. And it hasn't come back since. So here's my question. It's actually, I'm interested in more of a social question than an economic question. So the gap between, the Gini coefficient, the gap between the rich and the poor in Israel is still substantial. It's not getting better. It's getting worse, if anything. What's the long-term social effect in a society where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer? What can you predict might happen or will happen in a society where that's the condition?
Well, an economist who was the head of President Nixon's Council of Economic Advisors. Is it on? Okay. Herb Stein, head of President Nixon's Council of Economic Advisors, stated a very interesting economic principle. It's a little bit complicated, but my faith is on you. He said, things that cannot go on forever won't. So, what will happen? Well, a couple of things can happen. One is that the government can say, look, the people who are the largest beneficiaries of the economy should be paying, a large share of the wealth that they gain. Not because they're such geniuses, not because they're doing this all by themselves, but they're taking advantage of the infrastructure built by the state. They are utilizing the means of communication, of transportation, and so on and so forth to become very, very rich, mazel tov. But you need to, you need to pay for all that you receive, and you can increase the tax rate. You can increase the tax rate to a higher extent. You can do things like say, look, a lot of this wealth is accumulated not because these people are so tremendously hardworking or so very, very creative, although a number of them are very hardworking and a number of them are very creative, but a number of them are using the system. They're using the fact that the Israeli system really allows sort of concentration into, essentially trusts. It allows, vertical, integration, where you sort of capture the whole value chain. It has a whole series of regulations. Why is the price of cottage cheese so high? Well, because there are regulations that, basically limit the import of cottage cheese. And this and that and the other and vegetable oils and so on and so forth. Oh, it's all for public health reasons. Well, we want to make sure that, people really only get the best and so on and so forth. But the net effect is that it reduces the competitions. So there are a whole series of regulatory and legislative measures you can take that turns the problem of a relatively few future rich into less of a problem for others and more of a boon to society. There's another course that you can follow, and that is to do nothing and to let the resentment fester and to have this, poison the political discourse to the point where you really have, a sort of systemic dysfunction. And then you will probably wind up doing all of the things that I just described, but later on and at higher cost. It's worth mentioning, the issue of trust is a fascinating one. As you go around the world, you discover that there are places that are relatively high trust societies and relatively low trust societies. Take the United States. I don't think there is any other place where somebody would have come up with a business model like that for eBay and, received funding for it, much less, kind of demonstrate that you can make a fortune at it. I mean, eBay is predicated fundamentally on the idea that absolute strangers are trustworthy. That's all eBay does. It connects you with somebody else. You don't know each other. You're both, kind of trusting that, you're going to fulfill your end of the transaction. I can't imagine this service, this idea germinating anywhere else but in the United States. And then you look at a country like Mexico, where, if you have a successful business, it grows and you invest in it and so on and so forth, up to the point where it can still be managed by everybody, in your extended family. But when it comes time to take that next step, where now you would grow beyond the capacity of the family to deal with the management of the company, you plateau off, you level off. You're not going to take that next step because you can't trust people outside of your family. In Israel, it's a kind of a strange mixture of the two. on an interpersonal basis, the trust levels are very high. You know, I've sat in government offices having people tell me things that they had absolutely no business telling me, but simply because, you know, we had a cup of tea together and we talked and we made a few Jewish jokes, you know, they trusted me. And, you know, I repaid that trust. On the other hand, if you talk about now formal relations between the government and the people, it's really a low trust society. You know, you need to, you know, you need to put the 5 shekel coin into the supermarket, shopping cart, because they know that you're going to, you know, to run off with it if you're given half an opportunity. It's a society where the rules are, in the United States, basically you can do anything that you want, and basically if you transgress, you are punished. You know, but otherwise, you know, until you transgress, people sort of, you know, let you do what you want. In Israel, the assumption is that you will transgress. We need to think. We need to be smarter than you. You know, so we're gonna, you know, and that's the way government offices operate and so on. So, you know, if you don't deal with this problem of inequality, this feeds into this problem of distrust. And that has a lot of effects. Remember when I talked about innovation? And, you know, when you look at innovation hotspots, what you see is really, really dense networks of lots of people connecting with lots of people in lots of different ways. If you introduce problems of trust, if you amp up the problems of trust, that starts to fall away. If I can't trust you, you know, if we're on different sides of the economic divide and so on and so forth, if the ambient level of trust in the society, you know, rises, that has, I think, tremendous costs. And so that's kind of the second course that Israel can follow.
Okay, we have almost no time, so let's get a couple of questions and we'll do this together.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
By the way,
Mine is,
as an example of what the doctor said, there are no all-you-can-eat restaurants in Israel. No, very seriously.
It's inconceivable.
yeah.
You know, where you get a cup and you fill it up. I had Israeli friends, and I took them to Yogurtland, and they said, "Oh, Mashu, Zeloya left Baritz. You know, we couldn't do this in Israel." I said, "How come?" He said, "Because people will fill up the cup and eat all the ice cream before they weigh it."
Yeah.
Right now, you know there's a lot of Jews and Israelis in the neighborhood if you've ever eaten in one of the all-you-can-eat sushi restaurants on Ventura Boulevard, because there's a list of 47 rules, right? Like you can stay an hour and you can, because they know that this is what happens in a low-trust society. So there's no salad bars, no all-you-can-eat restaurants. That's just an interesting fact. What? No. If Israel had an all-you-can-eat restaurant, what would happen is there'd be a lady at the end of the buffet going, "Okay, honey, that's all you can eat."
Yes. Okay, can you tell us about the demographics of the people on the low end of the poverty scale? Are they ultra-Orthodox? Are they Ethiopians? Are they across the board? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, you put your finger on it. I mean, you've got a Haredi sector that now represents, I think I'm right, I haven't looked at these figures for a while, about 10% of the population, you know, from being absolutely minuscule, you know, in the days of the foundation of the state, you know, so small that Ben Gurion could say, you know what, you know, your yeshiva students, they don't have to go into the army, because what the hell difference is it going to make, you know, 400 kids, plus or minus, you know, it's less than a battalion. To the point where it's a very sizable size of the population. And not only is it a sizable size of the population, but it's a very young part of the population. The fertility rates are much higher, you know, in the Arab sector, although that's been coming down, part of a transition that's occurred throughout the Arab world. And then in the Haredi sector. Now, this is a sector that lives by and large on, on the government dole. There are subventions, there's support to the yeshivot, to the yeshiva students, and so on and so forth. There's the equivalent of aid to families with dependent children, and so on. As you're probably aware, there's not one but 4 different, government school systems in Israel, right? There's the secular school system, there's the religious school system, there's the Arab sector school system, and then the Haredi school system. Now, the Haredi school system, in order to get their government funding, has to agree to certain norms, which nobody ever checks on. So, they agree to teach mathematics, they agree to teach science, they agree to teach foreign languages, and they don't. And they still get the money from the state. Why? Because, well, remember what I said about the stasis and the political situation. They're the make-weight. They're the ones who decide who is going to be the government. And so they represent a large fraction of the poor population as a result. Now, it's interesting to see, I'm going too long in these answers, aren't I? Okay. It's interesting to see kind of the laws of economics come into play, because, there was a period in the early part of the last decade where the amount of child support you received actually increased. So the 8th child, you got more money than you did for the 7th child, and more than you did for the 6th child. And so, well, you can understand why they had that. Again, it was a kind of a coalition agreement, that was signed between the parties. Actually, this happened even before that. The Haredim lost seats in the Knesset. They were less important to the coalition, and so they introduced a change where, in fact, no, you only receive support up to a certain number of children, but it didn't go beyond that, and so on. And they were out of government between 2013 and 2015. That's when they changed the law temporarily. It's now been suspended on, military service and, subsidies to the Haredim and so on. So you can see in the economic tables the results of this. You can see, the number of people living in poverty, the labor participation rate, and so on, really responding to the fact that, hey, they're going to pay us to have kids, so we'll sit home and we'll have kids. And then when those rules change, all of a sudden you begin to see an increase in the labor participation rate of Haredi men, sort of declines in levels of poverty, increases in the number of wage earners per household, and so on. So the system, people do respond rationally to some of these economic signals. But yes, so it's the Haredi sector. So that's 10% of the population, right there. It's the Arab sector. The biggest labor participation problems are Haredi men and Arab women. Although the Arab women, that's really sort of a factor of education. If you compare Arab women with a similar level of education to Jewish women, the participation rate is approximately the same. Ethiopians who came in the first wave, because they were absorbed in the same way that the state absorbed the new immigrants in the 1950s, which is, to kind of put them into immigrant camps, and then assume that they're going to find their way out of those camps. Well, the people who were moved to Dimona, in the initial wave of the Ethiopian, immigration, they're still there, and their descendants there, and so on. And then there are the people who came in the second wave, where now the policy was different. They didn't put them in separate camps. They said, you can live in Tel Aviv, and we will support you financially for a few years, and we will, send you to Ulpan and give you training and so on, and then that's it. And those people are actually, pretty well integrated, becoming increasingly better integrated into Israeli society. And then, it's probably disproportionate, Mizrahi Jews, people from Middle East and so on and so forth, but, a certain number of the Russian immigrants as well. Yeah, please. Oh, oh, you have the microphone, therefore you are king.
Thank you. How do these issues relate, if at all, to the politics, both that which changed in 1977, and then when you show the current breakdown of the broad blocks of politics and their attitude about these issues?
Yeah, okay. That's an interesting question. And here is, I think, where you still see, you know, a substantial divide. You don't find a lot of, you know, Mizrahim, you know, Sephardi Jews in the Meretz party, which is the, you know, basically socialist, you know, democratic socialist party. You know, you will see some representation in Zionist Union, the current incarnation of labor and so on. You will still see a lot of, in Likud, you know, a large proportion of Mizrahim, who also, if you look at the religious breakdown, these are the people who are called Masorti, conservative or traditional in Israeli parlance. And what this means is that, you know, they come from a Sephardi family, a religious observant family. They themselves, you know, they wear a kippah, you know, and you know, will kiss the mezuzah going in and out. But you know, they'll drive to the beach on Shabbat, and you know, maybe go to synagogue actually a few times a year and so on. Those are the Masorti. They're largely Sephardic. The settler parties, like I'm going to mess it up. It's not Yisrael Beitenu. It's Bayit HaYehudi. They're, you know, they're settlers which, you know, have a fairly high proportion of Ashkenazim, of you know, a North American and so on and so forth. So, you know, it's interesting. It's not only that, you know, the different parties have different representations, you know, ethnically and other ways of slicing the society. The interesting thing is that in Israel, everything has a political identification. A university isn't a university. It's, you know, Tel Aviv University has its political identification. Hebrew University, Haifa University, Bar Ilan University, and so on. All of the think tanks, you know, INSS has, you know, has one, you know, is perceived as having one orientation. The Israel Democracy Institute. It's a chessboard in which all of the, you know, the pieces have their own color, and they're all kind of, you know, kind of locked into, you know, a system of, you know, kind of checks and so on. So, you know, a study comes out by, you know, a policy research institute. Immediately, you know, people know how to regard it, rightly or wrongly. You know, this is how it's regarded, or a professor from, you know, the history department of this university as opposed to that university. This is one of the reasons why I and my project teams were able to be relatively effective in this environment, because, you know, we were men from Mars. You know, we were viewed as objective. And the interesting thing is that there was a real hunger for this. And people really saw value. They sort of, yeah, they thought we'd do an okay job, but what they really knew is that we would be objective. And there's this sense that, you know, which news channel you look at. Well, of course, we're getting that way as well, but it's really sort of a kind of an extreme case. I rambled. I hope I addressed your question. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, you could say that. So the question was, for those of you who didn't hear it, whether the, you know, the policies themselves change with the different governments in power, and does that affect situations like equality and so on. Yeah, I mean, you know, there's a trade-off, there's a spectrum. You know, in one extreme you have the welfare state where, you know, no one is going to get rich and no one is going to get poor, and you all sort of live in kind of genteel poverty, and, you know, all the shoes are of one color, you know, and people who want to be entrepreneurial and have capacity and capability just, are driven nuts by a system like that. And at the other extreme, you have, a society where, you live by your wits, you make your connections and so on, you can achieve great wealth. On the other hand, if you flame out, there's very little to save you from, a death spiral and so on. And so all societies are somewhere, in between. Nicolae Ceausescu's Romania was, at one end of the extreme in terms of not only a welfare state, but basically a state where, any sort of initiative was severely punished, versus, just, maybe, well, I don't know if Singapore is a good style because that's a sort of a classic police state, but, just sort of wide open. So yeah, when Likud came in, they had been really chafing under Labor's Zionist regime, Bibi Netanyahu's father was a refugee to the United States because he couldn't imagine living in an Israel, ruled by Ben-Gurion and Mapai party. And so when these people came into power, they were very interested in increasing the opportunity, increasing the ability of people to, kind of break out of this mold, and at the same time, dismantling a lot of what had been there before in the safety net. So to be sure, that set up the possibility of, the Israel that we see today. And it then accelerated, of course, in the 1985 stabilization program, really saying we really need to get out of this former model. So it makes a really big difference, absolutely. He has the microphone.
What do you see
You
as
can
the
have it next.
opportunity for improving socioeconomic mobility, upward mobility? What has to happen in Israel in order to improve the current situation?
There are quite a number of civil society groups that are trying to deal with exactly that. And a lot of the, sort of the Archimedean point, if you will, the point of leverage is what kind of service you do in the IDF. So for example, there's an organization, I think it's called Atidim, Futures, that work specifically with high school kids in disadvantaged communities. They go to Dimona, they go to the Ethiopian community, they go to South Tel Aviv, and so on and so forth. And they work with them in an intensive sort of technological upskilling. They're teaching them computer, coding, and they're teaching them, electrical engineering, and so on and so forth. So by the time of the Baghut, the high school examination, and then the psychometric testing by IDF does a lot of psychometric testing. They are in a position to move into the Talpiot program, which essentially gives them, the equivalent of an engineering degree while they are in service, or they can become part of Unit 8200, which is really the foundation of the computer and information technology industry in Israel. So that changes their entire career trajectory. If they can do service in a good unit in the IDF, then they're actually set. Then they have the tickets punched to become part of the technological and business elite of Israel. And so that's where a lot of the effort is focused, is getting these kids to the point where when they enter IDF, they're not sent to the Magav, the border patrol, which is actually part of the police. It's not even part of the IDF. They're sent to these, technologically advanced technical elite units. And there are other efforts as well, but that's I think one of the most interesting and characteristically Israeli.
Can you quantify two things for me? The portion of the electric power that's produced by renewables, and the portion of electric power is saved by heating water directly into solar boilers without going through the stage of making electricity.
So, I mean, the question is based on the fact that you go to Israel, and on the top of every roof, there is, a solar installation. It's basically a solar hot water heater. And, well, this is really very advanced. This is really cool stuff. And it kind of dates back to the 1960s. And that's when it was a regulation passed. And so you think, wow, this country is really very advanced when it comes to, alternative energy and so on. But it basically stopped there. There are research stations. Actually, there's one just outside of Sde Boker. If you go visit, Ben Gurion's, kibbutz after he retired, you can see the solar installation research center there. But it didn't go much beyond that. And there are various reasons for that. Part of it has to do with the attitude of the Ministry of Finance, who are not going to look at any investment in any technology that was not already proven and up and running elsewhere. And so it really didn't make it possible for these experimental designs to go to scale in the country. So in fact, Israel is relatively laggard in the use of renewables. I can't recall seeing any wind turbines now that I think of it. I was just in Northern Ireland a few weeks ago, and you saw wind turbines all over the place. It's actually not a very good place for wind turbine technology. The Mediterranean has no tidal action to speak of, and so that really isn't a possibility. There are some experimental thermal installations, geothermal installations, but it's not a very good country for geothermal either. So it's actually kind of below the curve, which is kind of interesting because when I did a project on strategy for energy use in Israel, we looked at a lot of different alternative strategies, a lot of different, possible, future paths and so on. And what we found is that having some sort of a renewable standard, portfolio standard, that is, say, requiring a certain amount of renewables in the energy portfolio, actually was kind of crucial to coming up with a robust energy plan for Israel. So, I haven't really looked into this for about 5 years. I don't know what has happened recently, but it was actually kind of remarkable how little of that actually occurred in Israel.
There was a plan that was put forward to put a large plant right underneath the Knesset because it's so full of hot air. You could have generated all the electricity that Tel Aviv needed. I want to thank Dr. Popper for being with us.
Thank you all very much.
And we'll see you Friday night for Sephardic music, Sunday for Micha Goodman, and next Wednesday night. Thank you. Be careful out there. It's dangerous.